All right, folks, welcome back to our second lecture of the day. This one, I promise, will be much briefer. We're just going to briefly talk about Derlin's piece on the guerrilla theater of Greenpeace and a Marguerite Waller's piece called Borda Boda or Divorce Fronterizo. My Spanish is not good, even though I lived in Texas for a really long time, which is sort of embarrassing, so you'll have to forgive me if I mispronounce some Spanish when we talk about that. So the main focus that I want to bring to both of these pieces is on the potential of activist performance and on the use of images in that type of performance and the way we should interpret but also think about the mobilization of images in performance as being politically or socially consequential. So Derlin's piece talks about the organization Greenpeace, which was much more active in the 80s and 90s and probably more well known then than they might be now. But they are famous for initiatives to save the whales, for instance, for environmental initiatives and for animal rights initiatives. And the examples that Derlin talks about here all reflect those political goals. And Derlin wants to frame their activist performance, what he calls guerrilla theater, as a way of encouraging the audience to bear witness. So he describes bearing witness as, quote, a radical street performance uses heightened means to direct attention onto actions of social magnitude, often at sites where they actually occur, and from a perspective that would otherwise be missing. So the notion here then is that the audience is the one that can bear witness by remembering, by taking responsibility for their awareness of a political or social or cultural reality, by recovering what they don't think about every day but they already knew, like environmental concerns, for instance, are something that I think in our present moment are slipping to the back of our consciousness while we deal with COVID and police brutality and the number of other pressing social and political issues we're dealing with today. But environmental issues are still, climate issues are still something that is incredibly pressing and pose an existential threat. So bearing witness is about taking responsibility to what we think about, for what we remember, for what we choose to prioritize. And what Derlin is describing is the way that Greenpeace uses what he calls guerrilla theater, which is the performance of, or the use of certain theatrical acts to make a political point without it being a formal theater production or a authorized, in many cases, theater production. In many cases, Greenpeace has actually broken the law, but that is not something I'm encouraging you to do in your own performances, but that is part of guerrilla theater sometimes. So an idea of this sort of radical type of performance as a way of getting audience attention in order to make them bear witness to something, in order to get an audience to bear witness to something. And bearing witness, Derlin says, has personal, collective, therapeutic, and political dimensions. That is, it is something that happens on the individual level, but when we all bear witness together, it has a collective effect. It has a political effect. It is something that can help us therapeutically by making us own up to or really recognize political issues that exist or social issues that exist in our world. But at the same time, it is about trying to create that kind of change. So Derlin's point here is that when we bear witness, the idea is not just that Greenpeace is like up on a soapbox telling people what to think or that something is wrong. The idea is that Greenpeace is trying to get people to contemplate something so that they have their own personal and response to it, so that they cultivate a collective response to something that individuals ought to care about, but oftentimes forget to care about. So the way in which Derlin describes this then is as an image war. This is an image war. And I like this metaphor, but there's another metaphor that comes more from rhetoric that I like a lot, which is the idea of the public screen. In both of these cases, the idea is that the national or the international, the public audience, their attention is divided to a lot of other places. You're watching Friends, you're watching TikTok, you're watching the news, right? So you need something, if you are a political group, that's going to capture the public screen, that's going to capture what the media is talking about and broadcasting in a way that allows you to reach a giant audience now, because that sort of mass audience is what is most important in contemporary politics, would be sort of the assumption, at least, that this sort of strategy is based on. So in an image war, then, or to capture the public screen, Greenpeace creates highly visual images that become news, and that the media and people who are interested in rumors and controversy and the salacious would rush to spread. So by creating events that were shocking, for instance, a performance in which a film shows a glamorous fashion show, then one of the models comes out in a fur coat which coats the audience in blood, or by stretching a banner shaped like a gas mask over the mouth of George Washington on Mount Rushmore, or by draping a different banner that says, "Give me liberty from nuclear weapons," over the Statue of Liberty. All of these are images that are, or symbols that are meant to capture the public screen, that are meant to compete in this image war, and in this way, make the, as we've said, enjoin the common public audience to bear witness to the threat of nuclear weapons, the threat of environmental pollution, or the threat of or the problems associated with animal cruelty and the fur industry, and those three different examples. Durland, in his discussion, does talk about how in Greenpeace's history, or over the course of these uses of guerrilla theater events, there has been at times moments in which the shock value of the performance has possibly outweighed the message, where the questions are not about the cause, but instead, for instance, how high up in the air the activists were when they hung the banner. And they talk about then, in this circumstance, how there has to be a sort of balance in this type of image-based theater, or in this type of theater that is based on shock and a sort of guerrilla mentality, between the provocative, because it is shocking, because it is novel, and staying on message and actually getting people to participate or bear witness to the issues that you want them to. So it shouldn't just be like, ah, cool. It should be, oh, I see the symbolism of this gas mask. And there's a possibility then that if you create too shocking of an image or too provocative of a performance, that your message might get lost. But Durland wants to argue that overall, through this use of provocative imagery, through this use of guerrilla performance that is oftentimes site specific, meaning it's in particular places that are affected by these issues, they have succeeded in drawing public attention to a lot of important and pressing issues. And Durland then concludes talking about how Greenpeace participates again in the empowerment of the audience, not in the same way that Boal does, in actively saying that, oh, come and participate, although, I mean, we could probably join Greenpeace if we wanted to. There at least would likely be a vetting process. They don't just call anybody up to participate in these guerrilla theater acts. But it does give the audience the feeling, Durland argues, that something can be done about these issues. And Greenpeace then succeeds in creating images that actually have an impact on people's lives, and creating images that have an impact on people's lives. So we're gonna transition then to talking about the piece on the activism at the border by Marguerite Waller, and then we're going to conclude by synthesizing these two pieces together, or talking about their takeaways together. So we're just going to transition now. I'm just going to pause it really quick, but same lecture, and I'll be right back. All right, so to conclude then, we're going to move on to talk about Waller's piece on the entitled Border Boda, or Divorce Fronterizo, which is about a set of competing protests and counter-protests that occurred on the Texas-Mexico border that used performance, both of the performance and the counter protest, or both the protest and the counter protest, used performative methods in dialogue to have a political debate on a central and controversial matter. So this is set in the 1980s, and you can tell because later on there's a reference to the Berlin Wall as a contemporary political issue. So we can see just by reading this article that issues that are very important to us right now involving immigration and the rights of immigrants have a long-standing history and have been debated and protested over for some time. What I want to focus on in our discussion of the article is how the two groups that she talks about, so the first group of right-wing activists or far-right activists who initially organized and participated in the Light Up the Border protests, and the counter-demonstration that was organized by a group called La Comadres, and again, I'm not sure if that's exactly how you would pronounce that, or sorry, Las Comadres, which is a multicultural women's artist and activist group who is working in the area at the time. And so the narrative that she tells, which is pretty clear probably from your reading, is that this right-wing political groups involved in this original protest called Light Up the Border would assemble their cars on the border and then turn on their headlights to illuminate the issue of illegal immigration, literally shining their headlights into a no man's land or an unoccupied territory on the other side of the border where purportedly a great deal of illegal immigration would be happening. So we have this idea then of a right-wing group that is employing a symbolic or like a symbol being light as a protest method, as a performative protest method, to try to shine light or illuminate what they believe to be a pressing political issue. What she talks about here is that, first of all, Marguerite Waller, the author, emphasizes that many of these groups seem to not have a sophisticated knowledge of the history of the region that they were protesting on, which was originally Mexican, Tejano, and Native American land. So there is then this discourse that happens in the essay about how many of these protesters, or the counter-protesters that met with these far-right groups, were trying to educate them or convince them that their perceptions of the situation as they were protesting it were in some ways inaccurate. But on top of that dialogue, the counter-protesters of Los Comadres organized two image events, as we were talking about them in talking about the last piece in Greenpeace, two events that used symbols and symbolic performative strategies in order to counter that right-wing discourse. So she gives two examples. The first one I think is perhaps more provocative in our contemporary moment because it depends less on a cultural or historical reference, which is that Los Comadres and the counter-protesters took out mirrors and other reflective objects in order to shine the light that the protesters were shining back onto them. So Waller describes this by saying, quote, by using, so Waller describes this by saying, quote, by doubling the gaze, undoing the Watson-Headcock faction's implied monopoly of the power to illuminate the border, the counter-demonstrators made looking, at least symbolically, reciprocal and interactive. Made looking at least symbolically reciprocal and interactive. So I think that there are a couple of important parts to pull out of this interpretation. So first of all, we have the idea that in this initial performance, the Light Up the Border protesters were making a particular claim to power, saying that they have the power to look into or look across the border to use their sight then to expose what they think of as being a political problem. So what Waller is arguing is that the first thing that using the mirrors as a reflective tool does is deny that that power is one-sided. It says that the counter-protesters, too, have that power to shine light, to illuminate. So it is a claim to power. But at the same time, she's saying, or not but in addition to that, she says that it has another sort of symbolic effect, which is that because they're holding up mirrors or reflective surfaces, not only are they shining light or illuminating the protesters themselves as being problematic, in the same way that the protesters are trying to illuminate the border as being problematic, but they are also encouraging or creating the conditions for the protesters, the light up the border protesters who are looking at those mirrors to then be looking upon themselves. So it creates the condition for this kind of reflection. So she says then that at least symbolically this occurs, which means that she can't say for sure that the demonstrators who looked into those mirrors actually did interact with or engage in reflection on their own activities, but at the very least, symbolically, what happens here is that when these protesters are looking across the border, they look back at themselves and have light shone back on themselves. So this act of political viewing becomes doubled back on the protesters who are originally using it. The second important performative piece of protest that she describes here on the part of Los Comadres, or the counter-protests, is that they hired a plane, and that plane flew over the area where the demonstrations were going on, that carried a banner that said, 1,000 points of fear. So referring then to the headlights, like points of light. So 1,000 points of fear, another Berlin Wall. And so, as we said, there's a cultural reference here that has a particular importance, especially in its context. You've probably heard people talk about another Berlin Wall more recently, when Trump, for instance, was talking about building a literal border wall. But as we said, the Berlin Wall is contemporary to this time period. That is, there is literally the Berlin Wall dividing East and West Germany in what was then the USSR and then the Western Europe, or between Eastern and Western Europe at the time. So the idea here is that, as opposed to, for instance, now when somebody is like, it's going to be a new Berlin Wall, and that might register as sort of abstract to us or just symbolic, at the time, that symbol is really concrete. It is exactly what the United States has been opposing overseas for forever, or through the entirety of the Cold War, at least. So the idea here, then, is that this message, the symbol of the Berlin Wall, and the equation of this protest to the erection of a Berlin Wall, or to the building of another Berlin Wall, is really powerful, or a powerful invocation of a symbol or a reference, especially because the right-wing groups that were supporting these protests are the same, or have the same political affiliations that would lead them to oppose the Berlin Wall in a really pronounced fashion. So there is a way in which, by evoking the symbol, then, they're creating an appeal to this group that is supposed to be tremendously powerful in this particular context. And as Waller says, she can't say for sure what the cause of what happens next is, but that right-wing movement did dissipate over time. Although we might think about how those cultural attitudes or hostilities towards immigration have not dissipated, the actual movement at the border did. So she counts this as perhaps a success for this performative counter-protest that we've been describing. So to wrap things up then, the main takeaway is that I want us to get from both this article and the Derland article that comes before it is the importance of symbols or images, and also the importance of site-specific performances. So symbols and images and site-specific performances, and how both of these matter to activist performance or guerrilla performance, or the use of performance to try to create social or political change in a more general way. So in terms of the discussions of these symbols that we've had so far, I think that the most important thing that we want to emphasize here is that in almost every one of these examples, what we see happen with the symbol is that something that is symbolic or connotes a particular meaning is then paired with another symbol in a way that's supposed to produce tension and therefore create a reaction from the audience. So if you think then back to the Derlin piece, for instance, you put a gas mask on, or a banner shaped like a gas mask, over the mouth of George Washington on Mount Rushmore. So George Washington on Mount Rushmore is a particular kind of symbol, a symbol for American history, symbolic of the founding fathers, symbolic of the very identity of America itself. So when you then take a banner that has a gas mask and put it over George Washington's mouth. That second symbol about toxic environments, about air pollution, about coal mining, about environmental destruction, however you interpret that, is put into tension with the symbol of George Washington. Why in the United States would George Washington be wearing a gas mask? So when we think about symbols, I think it's important to think about not only what the symbols actually connote, so what does George Washington stand for, what does the gas mask stand for, but what those symbols do when they're put in conversation with one another. So in the Statue of Liberty example, for instance, it's similar. The Statue of Liberty is holding a banner that says, "Give me liberty from nuclear weapons." So it relies on one sense of liberty, the one that is connoted by the Statue of Liberty and its promise of the American dream, and uses it to make a point about liberty from fear and connect that to a particular social and political and environmental concern at the time, being the concern over the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So all of those things then are taking symbols that create a contrast and using them in a productive way. So similarly, when we think about the light up the border examples that we were just talking about, the contrast is maybe less apparent, but they're still in some ways the symbols are supposed to in some ways create tension. So for instance, when they shine the light back on the original protesters, that is supposed to, in some ways, create tension between the original action of the protesters and the actions of the counter protesters in a way that produces another point. So you have the symbol, in other words, that the original protesters are using, light, in order to talk about illuminating an issue that they think has been not sufficiently addressed, or illuminating holes in the United States' approach to immigration, however you want to conceive of that initial symbolic gesture. And then they take the mirrors and use them to say, your original symbol is something that we can turn back on you, and this light, this reflection, actually is illuminating you as the problem. So in that way, they take the original protester symbol and they turn it back on them. Similarly, there's an implicit contrast in the way that they talk about the Berlin Wall. So they're comparing then the 1,000 points of light, as we said, of the headlights to the Berlin Wall. In making the comparison, though, between the Berlin Wall and what is going on in the United States, they are implicitly saying, let's contrast what we think the values of the United States are with the values of what East Germany has at the time, or the USSR's values. Those are not supposed to be the same, but it implicitly draws that contrast by using the symbol of the Berlin Wall. So these are ways then we can think about symbolic language or images that communicate symbols as working to convey political points, to create productive tensions around political issues, of getting people to think critically about political or social or cultural issues through their connotations, through their resonance with the audience, but also through the productive tension, as we say, that they can create with other symbols. And I want you to think about, because one of the requirements is to use two images or two symbols in your own final performances, I want you to think about creative tension when you're selecting those symbols. I want you to think about the ways in which those symbols can really be used to communicate and the type of communicative work that they're doing. Then the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of these pieces is the notion of site-specific performances. Site-specific performances. I think we see two kinds of site-specific performances here that are worth unpacking a little bit. One of them is when the site itself becomes sort of a symbol in the performance. So the protest at the Statue of Liberty, for instance, that is not happening because nuclear weapons are stored at the Statue of Liberty. That is happening because the Statue of Liberty is symbolic of American freedom, and they want to play off of that symbol. So in some ways, then, site-specific performances are things that you work to mobilize a place or a scene or a particular context as a symbol, and use that place or context to add to the overall resonance of the performance. In the second example, in the example of the Los Comadres protests at the border, the site is different. It's not just symbolic, it's really the material site where things are being contested. So the use of performance there is a way of actively intervening into the struggle that actually occurs in that place, at that site. So if you're thinking about, for your own performance, doing site-specific performances, this is sort of how I was imagining it in some ways, is that on the one hand, you might think about how, for instance, performing on Facebook has a particular symbolic resonance or symbolizes something, and you can play up that symbolism as being part of your site-specific performance. Or, on the other hand, you can think about Facebook as a place where there's actually some sort of active political or social contestation going on that you want to intervene in some ways, and so it has to be on that site. So, for instance, several months ago, when Elizabeth Warren was still running for president, Facebook at the time was refusing to moderate the speech of political candidates, even if they were sharing false news, which otherwise would have violated their content violation policies because they said they didn't want to demonstrate political bias, rather. So they would let some speech that would violate their content moderation policies pass because Trump said it or because another politician said it. And so Elizabeth Warren, as a response to this, in what I think is really a performative gesture, her campaign posted something saying that Mark Zuckerberg had officially endorsed Donald Trump as president, which was not true, but she was calling Zuckerberg and Facebook on the idea that they wouldn't moderate false claims even when they affected or were implicated Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, himself. So the idea behind that performance then is that it is a performative critique of the content moderation policies that Facebook had adopted. And it couldn't happen anywhere else because it has to be site-specific in that way, because Facebook is the place in which that content moderation policy was put into place, in which these effects were happening, in which this debate was occurring. So you had to do it on the site then. So when you're thinking then about site-specific performances, you can think about the digital as a site, a place where many of us will have to perform in the future if we are going to perform for public audiences. And so what does it mean to do a site-specific performance on social media in general? On the flip, you could think about, what does it mean to do a site-specific performance at a protest, or out on the street, or in a socially distanced sort of setting right now? So, for instance, and again, I'm never recommending that you go out and get yourself sick or anything, but in a circumstance where many people are not wearing masks right now, and that is becoming a big social or political issue, you could think about doing something like Boal's invisible protest or invisible theater, where you went out into public and you enacted in front of an unsuspecting audience a dialogue about this issue loudly enough for it to have a political effect on an unintended audience. And that could be site specific, or you could be doing some other kind of performance at a protest, like the protest performances we were just talking about. Those would also count as site specific if the performance could not be done anywhere else. So that wraps up the main things that I wanted to talk about that I think should really feed into how you're conceptualizing your final performance products. That is, we talked about participatory performance, we talked about using symbols or images as symbols in your performances, and we talked about the ways in which you can conceive of performances as activists and the role that site-specific performance plays in activist or in guerrilla performances. So that's where we're going to wrap up today, and that does wrap up our total class lecture. So everything from here on out is just going to be us meeting and talking about your performances during workshops, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how those turn out again. But if you have any questions about this content or any other content, remember you're free to post a final exam review question, which is like a last FAQ that I would be happy to answer if that would be helpful for you. But otherwise, I hope that y'all have really enjoyed this course as much as I have enjoyed teaching it, which I really genuinely have. I hope that you feel like you've learned some things about what it means to perform and also what it means to study performance. And I hope that you have a better and more robust understanding of what it means to perform in everyday life as a person whose everyday actions have real political and social and cultural effects. That is the main thing that this course is meant to communicate, is that it doesn't matter whether you're performing at the level of being on stage or at the level of waking up and brushing your teeth, that every performance that we do in life contributes to culture, contributes to society, contributes to politics in some way, shape, or form, no matter how small. So we need to be sensitive to the role that performance plays, and we also can look to performance as a resource for making the world different. So again, I hope you enjoyed this course. I definitely enjoyed this course. I'm really looking forward to your final performances and corresponding with you in the next couple of days. And yeah, I'll be in touch via email. But thanks for everything, and I'll talk to you soon.